Hey folks, what's up? Welcome to the next video. So, in my last video, I did a massive library haul. All these books that I had put on my TBR, I finally picked up just to check out and see if I was going to keep them on my TBR. Spoiler alert, most of them stayed. So now I have to try to read them. But what I noticed is that there was a very large proportion of books that I had in my possession that were being very influenced by booktubers. Specifically in this case, one booktuber, Jen Campbell. I have 8 books here that I have read that are all based on recommendations from her. So I figured I would talk about them because why not? We all love those reading booktuber favorite videos, at least I do anyways. I watch a gazillion of them. And so figured, you know what, she very much influenced the reading that I had in my possession. So let's see how she did. Because the thing about Jen Campbell that I've noticed is she reads a lot of translated work. And what I've noticed about these books specifically is, while a lot of them are translated, they're also all quite small. And I don't know that the majority of her reading is this type of book, but the ones that I managed to get through were small. I really appreciated that. And so we're going to talk about them. I have 4 in ebook form and 4 physical. So we're going to talk about the ebooks first. The first one I read is Mother Dead by Vigdis Hjorth. And this is about a woman who has been in America for a really long time and is coming back to, I believe it's Norway, for an art show that she has. But she's estranged from her family, and she's trying to figure out if she should get in touch with her family. She doesn't even really know if they're alive or dead or what, but she assumes that everybody's alive. And this book is really interesting because there's very little dialogue in it. It's very much you're in the main character's head. What's her name? Joanna, I believe is her name. Let's see if I can find it really quickly. I think her name's Joanna. And you're in her head the entire time, and she's trying to kind of come to terms and come to grips and justify why their relationship is the way it is and why it should or shouldn't change. And it's the same with her relationship with her sister. She has a lot of kind of imaginary conversations in her head about how she assumes something has played out, but she doesn't really know. And it's a fascinating look at what you expect to happen versus what actually happens. I think we've all done that, right? We've all had those conversations in our head and thought, this is how it's going to go, and then it goes a totally different direction. I felt like that was a lot of this book. I enjoyed it. I don't love books about like motherhood necessarily, and while this book isn't about that, the relationship between the mother and daughter is very much the most prevalent thing in this book. There is not a lot of plot necessarily. It's pretty introspective. And I think that's something else I noticed in reading these books that Jen Campbell has enjoyed, is it's a lot of introspective. It's a lot of stream of consciousness writing. And that's not typically the sort of writing that I really enjoy. So I think for me, that's why it's not like a favorite, but I still enjoyed it as a book. And if you like that kind of thing, it's definitely one worth checking out. It was definitely put on a prize list. I think it was up for the Women's Prize in Fiction. It was not shortlisted, it was longlisted, but definitely a book really well written. It was a translated work, I believe. It's the problem with ebooks. Translated by Charlotte Barsland. So it is a translated work. So good for August, which is Women in Translation Month. Women in Translation Month. Next up, we have All Yours by Claudia Pinheiro, translated by Miranda France. So yet again, another translated work. Like I said, definitely a theme in Jen's books recommendations. And Women in Translation Month, holy pants, am I having trouble with that phrase, is August. So put it on the TBR for that one. And this is a thriller. It follows a woman who discovers that her husband is having an affair follows him one night and sees him murder his mistress, accidentally murder his mistress. And it goes from there because she wants to cover up, because she kind of wants to keep the life that she has. She's very content with it. And so decides to help him cover up this crime, but doesn't tell him outright that she is doing this. And so she ends up at the mistress's house. She ends up at his job. She does all these little things, but slowly as time ticks by, fractures appear, as they would in this plan, and kind of the outcome of that. And then to top it all off, you're also following their daughter, and their daughter is going through something of her own, but she's been put on the back burner, and you can see how both parents really impact the daughter, who's not only going through her own things, but is also finding out things about her parents at the same time. It's a big tangled mess, and it spirals as any thriller does. But I quite enjoyed this. I didn't enjoy the first book I ever read by Claudia Pinheiro, which was Elena Knows last year. It was a big book because I think it was it a women's prize? But I don't remember. It was all over the place. I wasn't a big fan of that one, but I really did actually enjoy this thriller by her. And that was a lovely little thing to find. So if you're looking for a thriller, again, short, easy to read, very fun to pick up. We next have Permafrost by Ava Beltzar, translated by Julia Sanchez. This is the same author who wrote Boulder, and I didn't like Boulder very much. I liked this one a lot more, and this follows a woman who is kind of just drifting through life a little bit, and she has a relationship with her sister, but it's very much about mental health. It's quite at the forefront. This woman is always thinking about ways in which she could possibly end her life, and what that does with the way she sees the world. It's really about figuring life out, essentially, and trying to understand the people around you, but not really getting it. It's, again, stream of consciousness, not a lot of dialogue, but I enjoyed the protagonist's head in this. Well, enjoyed is maybe not the right word because of her state of mind, but as a reader, I liked where the story took me. So definitely one that I was glad to have been recommended. And then finally, in the e-form version, we have Ms. Ice Sandwich by Miko Kawakami. There we go. Translated by Louise Heel Kawai. This is a really interesting book because I feel like it's one of those books where there's a lot going on and I didn't really get it. Like if there was some big metaphor happening or what it was, I feel like somebody who's much more intelligent than me would have gotten more out of this book. And I feel like when I listened to Jen talk about this book, she had a lot more insight about what the novel was trying to say to the reader. So I would definitely recommend going and watching her talk about this book. But essentially it's about a boy who finds comfort in this woman who makes sandwiches at the grocery store. But he hears classmates talking about the woman and he doesn't really understand how they don't see her the same way he sees her. So really just fun little, the character's point of view I found to be different and fun to read through. Although again, as with most of these books, they're small and petite, but they still have a lot of depth to them. And I really like that in a book. So that was Ms. Ice Sandwich. And now we move on to books that I actually have physical copies of. First, we have Dry Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tsorczak. I don't know how to pronounce her name. I've looked it up. It has left me again. Tokarzek. Olga Tokarzek. And it has been translated by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. This was a weird book for me because it is said to be a thriller, but I don't think it is. I think it's definitely got mystery vibes to it, but it is a little literary and there is a problem to be solved or that needs solving because, you know, people are being murdered. But I would say the thriller aspect of it is a little misleading because it is not a page turner in that sense. And you actually are quite removed from the crimes, in that in a lot of thrillers you find the protagonist somehow inserts themselves into an investigation and all of a sudden is smarter than the police and is finding answers and discovering clues that ultimately leads you to the killer. And that doesn't happen in this. The crimes are present, but the author or the protagonist, her name is Janina, doesn't really insert herself into the investigation in a way that is really unbelievable. Like in a lot of thrillers, somehow this person gets put in and they're making all these calls and they're figuring all these things out, and you just have to suspend so much disbelief. And the protagonist doesn't do that in this book in the same way. She does insert herself, but it is not the typical way you would find in a thriller, and I think that's where, for me, it doesn't quite live up to that genre. However, it is still an interesting book. And I feel like there was so much potential for this book to lean into being kind of a speculative or unbelievable, like really kind of supernatural. I think there was a lot of potential for the book to go in that direction, and it doesn't. And I kind of wish it had, just because I think it would have made it a little creepier, a little different. Either way, it's got a really good cast of characters, really strong writing, and the way the story comes to a conclusion is I wasn't surprised by it, but I also didn't necessarily see it coming. And so I think that was a really interesting way to finish a mystery thriller book, and I quite enjoyed it. It did start slow, so I would say you need to give it a little bit of time to warm up, or I did anyways, but a lot of fun, and surprise, surprise, Women in Translation Month. We have Idle Burning by Rin Usami, translated by Asa Yonida from the Japanese. This is such a relevant book for now, and I'm not in a fandom of anything of any kind, but I could see how this would really speak to just a lot of people on the planet. It's about this girl Akari, who is in high school but has found herself to be pretty obsessed with, they call it her Oshi, O-S-H-I, and obsessed with this pop star essentially. She has a blog, she follows everything he does, and he ends up, there's kind of this scandal where I guess he punches a fan. And she's trying to figure out like how that could have happened and why, and then she tries to figure out whether or not she can still be a fan of him or can still get people to try to join the fandom of him, because she wants him to remain popular because he's such an important part of her life. And if he was to fade away, then she doesn't really know what she would do with herself. And so there's this kind of top superficial story about that, but underneath is this really dark look at mental health and the way and self-worth, and it's got a very sad undertone to it, even though its main premise seems to be very light and bubbly and just about following this pop star. And it was a really interesting balance of keeping the dark and sad, but mixing it really well with this very kind of lighthearted story. It was very similar to The Bandit Queen by Preeti Shroff, where there was a lot of levity, but there was a lot of depth and serious topic matter being talked about, and that book is this, but in a much shorter form and in a very different environment, obviously, but really interesting book. This took me, I don't know, maybe an hour to read. It's, well, probably a bit longer, but very quick, very short, but an interesting look at internet culture and fandom and mental health. Really fascinating. Does anybody else shed like a dog? Like everywhere, hair everywhere. We have Diary of a Boyd by Emi Yagi, translated by David Boyd and Lucy North. And this, I think I just realized that every book so far that I've talked about has been translated, hasn't it? So there really is a theme here for the short translated fictions. I feel like Jen must be up to date with publishing, with different publishing houses that publish this type of work, because I feel like I hear her talking about different publishing houses a lot, and that's not something that I personally am familiar with, but she clearly has her finger on the pulse of translated works. This was a book I picked up genuinely simply because she loved it. She liked it so much. Now, I think I remember her saying it's not like the writing was the greatest, but the story had stuck with her. And I wouldn't normally have picked it up because it is about a woman who's pretending to be pregnant. And frankly, pregnancy, motherhood, those stories, I have just no interest in reading them. But she was pretending to be pregnant because she wanted to get out of some of these duties she had at work, where she was noticing that because she was the woman in the office, she was kind of expected to deliver the coffee and clean up the coffee mugs and do the vacuuming and take out the trash. Those sort of more female roles was just automatically assumed it was going to be her responsibility. And one day she didn't want to do it. So she said the smell of coffee like made her sick or something because she was pregnant. And it follows that. But the thing is, this pregnancy just, it sticks with her in every other aspect of her life. Like all of a sudden she is pregnant and she acts like she is everywhere. She starts going to like mommy and me class, like all this wild stuff. And at some point you think this is going to come crashing down. And how the story wraps up was not at all how I was expecting it to wrap up. And that to me was one of the most fascinating things about it, was the ending. So if you like this, like if you don't like motherhood stories, I still think that there is some value to it here. But if you do like stories of women and just living their day-to-day lives, but also this kind of sinister aspect of really faking a lot about what is going on, just it's a fascinating look at a unique woman, essentially, because she's not the most likable of characters, to be honest, but she's compelling and you want to keep reading. And then finally, the only one that is not translated, The Subtweet by Vivek Shreya. And this is about two musicians who become friends, but after one of them doesn't accidentally, they send out a tweet, but they don't realize what the ramifications of that tweet is going to be. Things fall apart. And what's interesting about this book is you follow the two characters, Neela and Rukmini, through most of the book, and then by the end of the book you're really only following one character. And it's fascinating because after the fallout you'd really like to be following both to see how they both feel, but one disappears. Like you don't ever hear from them again to the entire book. And I think that was a really interesting way to tell this story, because she just kind of gets forgotten. And similarly to Idle Burning, there's a lot of internet commentary and music commentary and what should and shouldn't happen, and kind of like that mob mentality about grabbing something when you don't know all the facts and running with it. It also kind of reminded me of Yellowface a little bit in that aspect, and in just the internet culture thing that it talks to. I also loved about this book that it takes place in Toronto, and I lived in Toronto for several years. Now, the one thing that this book didn't get right, and it's only because I'm from Toronto, there's a building that was called the Sky Dome. It has not been called the Sky Dome now for years and years and years. It's now called the Rogers Centre, and they call it the Sky Dome in this. And I don't know if that was to set up a timeline, except that Twitter is so prevalent, and Twitter was not around like it is in this book when the building was called Sky Dome. So that was just the one little thing that I noticed, and I was like, oh, I kind of wish that had been fixed, but that's just a me thing. But again, small book, easy to read, and it was a lot of fun. I like books about music. I enjoy books about social commentary. I feel like every book here had some sort of bigger message that, like I said, about Idle Burning, which one was I talking? Oh, Diary of a Void. I think really intelligent people could write essays about and what is being said by the author and all the metaphors and stuff. I am not going to be that person. Plus, anything that I do say is just going to be probably regurgitating what I have read or heard other, particularly in this case, Jen Campbell say about these books, and those are not my thoughts, those are hers. But I greatly appreciate the books that she put into my hands, because they are all books that I never would have picked up on my own, and that is something I really love about watching booktubers who talk about books that aren't necessarily books that you are immediately drawn to, because there was some really great ones in that, and a lot of authors that I just never would have come across in any other aspect because they're not as well known, or they're smaller, they're translated, that sort of thing. And like I said, books that I don't typically gravitate towards because they're not going to be the ones that are on the front shelf, you know, in the bookstore or the main shelf of the library, and which is obviously where I get most of my books. But that is that. Thank you very much for watching. I will probably do this again with another booktuber in the future, but for now, thank you, Jen Campbell, because there were some bangers. I appreciate it. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.